Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to this short session for 30 minutes. Tim Baker's my name. And for those of you welcome back who've been in previous sessions of mine before, I want to talk about an interesting topic today around motivating people. And I think the first thing I want to say about that is it was a real eye-opener for me that when I was managing and I realized that I couldn't actually motivate people. You can't actually motivate people. At the end of the day, people make that decision themselves. So that's important. It's an important insight because all it means is that you and I can only create the right environment by which people become motivated. But beyond that, it's up to them to make that decision. So if you're trying to motivate people, then just stop and actually create the environment by which they may choose favorably to become motivated. And I guess I can give you the example there. If two people went to see a speaker, and one walked out and said, I really enjoyed that, I got a lot out of it, and the other one said, I got nothing out of it. They've both been exposed to the same stimuli, but one has chosen to take a different message out of it. I think that's very important. Now, the other thing I want to talk about specifically today is the whole notion of reward and punishment. Our organisations are pretty much geared up on rewarding people for meeting expectations and punishing people when they don't meet those expectations. And we often call this the carrot and the stick. And the research is showing us that carrot and stick doesn't work anywhere near as effectively as we might have thought. And in fact, there's some research, Daniel Pink's research, for example, that demonstrates that it actually does demotivate people, particularly knowledge workers, people who are working in the knowledge economy. So let me share my screen and we'll launch into the presentation. So those of you who don't know me, as I said, Tim Baker's my name. I'm a keynote speaker. I'm an author and I run workshops and still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane. So a little bit about the topic itself, if I may. And one of the key objections or concerns that people have when we talk about a topic like this is, isn't reward and punishment the best way to motivate people? After all, it's been used since industry has been born, and you would think that it works extremely well, but in actual fact, it doesn't work that well. And I want to share some research with you that demonstrates that to you. And what I would say to you is that what we're trying to do here is to bring the hearts and minds of people to work with them. So basically, what we're attempting to do is, instead of using extrinsic motivation, which is external to the person, in other words, reward and punishment, what we're actually trying to do is use what we might call intrinsic motivation. In other words, we're trying to spark or ignite that inner passion in people. And of course, as we know, engagement levels are at an all-time low and disengagement levels are an all-time high. And I think part of the reason for that is that we're using the wrong environment to motivate people. And I want to talk a little bit about that in this topic. And it comes from my book, The Future of Human Resources. So I'll talk about the research, and I want to spend a bit of time doing this because I need people to understand what the research is telling us, particularly in young children. And then I want to talk about intrinsic motivation. In particular, what I want to talk about there is 3 things that you can do that can make the difference in terms of creating the right environment, a favourable environment for people's intrinsic motivation to be ignited. And then I've got a special offer for you at the end of our presentation. So let's talk about this research, and I'm going to read this through. It's a little long, bear with me, but I think it's so important. I thought it was worthwhile sharing with you. And I guess I could sort of talk about this off the cuff, but I really believe that it's important to get the gist of this, because this is some of the most famous research that's done by Mark Lepper and his team. So Stanford University researcher Mark Lepper and his team conducted significant research studies in the early 1970s. Now you might say, well, isn't that a bit dated? Well, I think you will find that the research is still relevant today. And in fact, there's a lot of research that's reinforcing Lepper's initial findings. But basically it was concerning the impact of extrinsic rewards on performance. So he was interested to know whether, rewards actually contributed to motivation levels. So specifically what he did is he was interested in whether giving prizes would actually influence the behavior of young children. So it's fertile ground there because young children haven't been contaminated by all the influences in our society. So what did it actually tell us? Well, what he did is he introduced a brand new activity and to some children in a nursery. So what that was teachers actually gave the children some creamy white artist drawing paper and some brand new marker pens. Now, the children were given time to draw their novel, use this novel materials because they'd never used it before. So it was completely new to them, and they gave them an opportunity to, draw drawings on this. Now, predictably, the children took to the activity with relish, as you would, because it was a new activity. So there was no problem about motivational levels at this point. But after exactly an hour, what the researchers did is they whisked away the paper and pens, and much to the disappointment of the children. So they had an hour working on this activity. The hour came to an end and they pulled away the paper and the pens. And then several days later, one of the researchers returned to that classroom and randomly divided the class into two groups. So it was just like 1, 2, and just in a random way, divided the class into two groups to continue the new drawing activity. So one group of children were taken to another room and they were given the opportunity to continue their drawings just as they'd done before. So nothing had changed for that group. Basically, here's the paper, here's the pens, off you go. Now, after an hour, the researcher thanked the children in this group and took away the art material and their drawing. And the second group of children were offered a prize for their drawing. So their pictures, so that was the difference, that the second group were offered prizes as a sort of an incentive to get them to create the best picture. So what happened? So it was explained to some that the special prize would be given to the children who drew the best pictures. So that was explained to kids. The children took to their task, as you can imagine. They anticipated they might receive the prize for their drawing. And the control group was given the same amount of time, which was 1 hour, as the other group to complete their artwork. At the end of that session, the researcher thanked the children, as he'd done with the other group. But this time he handed out prizes to each child in the control group. Okay. So the difference was the extrinsic reward. Now, one week later, the researchers returned to the classroom. So now we're 2 weeks into the project. That afternoon period consisted of what they call free time. And the children could choose what they wanted to do. So the special paper and markers were left on a table and they were easily accessible to the group. However, the children had other options as well. So they could go outside and play, for example, in the playground. They could play with toys in the classroom, or they could return to the drawing activity. There were a lot of options there open. And the researchers observed that the time the children spent on their chosen activity, so the children had freedom of choice. To what extent would the prizes given to the children in the control group actually affect their choice and behaviour was the interesting question, because, of course, the researchers knew who they were. The researchers assumed, of course, that the children in the control group who'd received prizes would spend more time on their drawing activity. That was the assumption. But what was interesting about that is it didn't happen. What did happen? Well, the result was that the result was one that the researchers didn't foresee. Their findings did challenge the conventional wisdom about parenting and education. The children who received the extrinsic rewards in their artwork chose to spend less time drawing than those who weren't rewarded. Now that's interesting in itself, isn't it? So conversely, the children who didn't receive a prize chose to spend more time on their discretionary, or more time on the drawing activities. So the children who were awarded seemed reluctant to continue the activity without the promise of a further reward. The initial reward paradoxically reduced the children's motivation rather than increased it. Now, you might want to speculate as to why that might be, but I've got a few ideas about that. And basically, but what was even more, there was something even more surprising than that in the research. So the first interesting thought was that the children who were awarded initially weren't necessarily motivated to continue that activity, those that won prizes. The artwork of all the children were actually evaluated by a group of independent judges. So they came in and they looked at all of the drawings. They didn't know about the control groups. All they were doing is looking for artistic performance, basically. And the result was that the pictures drawn by the children who were awarded were evaluated as less competent than the pictures drawn by the unrewarded group. Now that's interesting, isn't it? So we've got two things happening here. The prizes didn't motivate people to continue the activity, and the prizes didn't actually motivate excellence in drawing. So what's that mean in summary? Well, the children who received an extrinsic reward spent less time drawing and were given, when given a choice, and when they were rewarded, they put in less effort too. So I guess the point about Lepper's research is that extrinsic rewards, in this case a prize, wasn't actually useful in terms of motivating a person to continue the activity, or in fact putting more effort into the activity. And so it's reasonable to assume that this is the case in the workplace, because obviously if people are awarded, then they're often doing the activity to receive the reward rather than for the activity for itself. And this is the big mistake that a lot of managers and organizations make when they use extrinsic rewards to motivate people. So another sort of concept here that's very, very important is that, does job satisfaction actually satisfy, does that actually mean that people perform better? So if people are more satisfied with their job, so for example, if you ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied were they in their job? And let's say a person gave an 8 or a 9 out of 10, which is a high score. You might assume that if people enjoyed their work, they would be, they'd perform better. But in actual fact, there's no conclusive research to demonstrate that in the literature. There's a lot of conflicting research in the literature, and there is some scant research to show that that might be the case, but it's not conclusive enough to make that conclusion. So really, what's interesting about this is that, and of course this is what organizations do, they basically give people extrinsic rewards because they believe that that will increase job satisfaction. And if they increase job satisfaction, that will lead to higher performance. But the research doesn't show that at all. So again, we're basing our reward and punishment regime in organizations on a false premise. And so someone that's necessarily satisfied about their job isn't necessarily a high performer, and vice versa. Of course, there are a lot of variables involved in this. I mean, satisfaction ebbs and flows, doesn't it? I mean, you know, you can be satisfied 1 minute and dissatisfied the next. So that's the first important point. Second thing is, of course, there's a whole bunch of other factors that come into play as to whether or not people are satisfied with their job. And just because someone is satisfied doesn't necessarily mean that they are actually performing either. So what this means is that we've got a little bit of thinking to do around this whole concept of job satisfaction and intrinsic rewards. And let me just define this for a moment. Intrinsic rewards are basically, intrinsic motivation is basically motivation that comes from within, in intrinsic, and ex outside. So what we want, and I'm sure you would agree with me, is we're looking for employees who are basically intrinsically motivated. And I often talk to recruiters about this, and they'll often tell me it's far better to find someone who is intrinsically motivated who may need to learn the skill set rather than having someone that has the skill set who is not intrinsically motivated. Because obviously, if you're intrinsically motivated, you can learn the skill set, provided it's not a huge leap, of course. So the question then, and the very important question, is how can we engage the hearts and minds of employees in their work? Ultimately, that's what this is all about. And as you can see from what I've just shared with you so far, using rewards is not necessarily the most productive way of doing that. So the question is, how can we connect people's human spirit and their work? Now, this is the perennial question. And organisations all over the world are looking at the silver bullet, if you like. And I think that really there is so much written about this that you can get completely lost in the literature on this. But ultimately, I think there are three key things that a leader can do. And remember, you can't motivate people. Three key things that a leader can do that can at least create the environment by which people may decide to be motivated. Because remember, it's an inner choice about whether someone is actually motivated or not. So what I'd like to do is actually have a look at what they are. And so this is the core of the presentation this morning, is that, and where does this come from? Well, Daniel Pink wrote a really great book called Drive, the surprising truth about motivation. And he did some rigorous studies in this area, and his conclusion was pretty straightforward. He argued that for rudimentary tasks, unskilled or semi-skilled work, rewards and punishment can work quite effectively. But he also found that for knowledge workers, that is people who use their brain and fairly skilled work in the workplace, rewards and punishment was not effective. In fact, he actually found, surprisingly, from his research, that it was actually counterproductive. So it's very similar to what Lepper came up with in his research with the nursery children and the drawing paper. He found that this was not actually an effective way to actually instill motivation in people, particularly knowledge workers. He argued that ultimately there were three key things that a knowledge worker required in order to have the environment where they may choose to be motivated. So what are they? He argued that one of those factors is that if you give people more freedom and autonomy to make their own decisions about the work they do, that was a factor. Now, let's face it, most people that have done a degree or have some education and they've learned to think about the problems that they're dealing with day to day, they want the freedom and autonomy to decide how to tackle those jobs. They want the freedom and autonomy to be able to, think differently about it and work through it. So this is critically important. So what it basically means is for a leader to actually create the motivational environment for knowledge workers to do their best work, they need to get off their back. They can't micromanage them. They can't basically, dictate to them that they've got to follow this system or that system. Now, obviously, there are certain things that have to be followed in the workplace. I'm not disputing that. But the point I'm making is that a leader who's a micromanager, or at least perceived to be a micromanager by those that are led by that person, is likely to have a detrimental impact on people's motivational levels. In other words, people are only doing it because ultimately they're going to hear from the boss if they don't follow through on whatever it is they do. Now, this has got huge implications for people working remotely. And now that we're certainly in the phase of hybrid working conditions where people spend some time working at home and some time working in an office, it basically means that in some respects, leaders really can't micromanage people to the same extent that they could if they were in the office with them. So the very first thing that's important is to give people freedom and autonomy to make up their own choices and decisions. Ultimately, that's got to be based on trust. And what that means, of course, is the manager's got to trust the individual to be able to make those choices and hopefully make good choices. And a lot of managers have a lot of problems with that. So that's the very first step, is to give people a sense of freedom and autonomy to decide how they do their work. Now, the second thing that's important is that knowledge workers, according to Daniel Pink's research, knowledge workers want to continue to grow and develop. And if people aren't given opportunities to be trained and develop themselves in their workplace, that can be a demotivator for most knowledge workers. Not all, but most. Now, what are we talking about when we're talking about growing and developing? Well, on one level, we're talking about technical skills. So if you're working in, say, IT, you may want to do, you may need to do a course, on a new piece of software. And, that would be growth and development for that person. But please don't think that it's just talking about technical know-how. It is also talking about personal development as well. So personal development, the definition of personal development is that the development that people receive indirectly help them to improve their performance at work. So for example, if you did a course on emotional intelligence, or perhaps you did a course on time management, that's not technical development, that's personal development. However, by doing courses like that, it might help you to get on with people. It might also help you to be a little bit more focused on your priorities and be a bit more productive. So in this sense, growth and development means a holistic approach to the person's development and not just their technical know-how. So that's the second aspect of it. So, organizations that have cut their training and development budgets because they're trying to cut costs or whatever, are actually probably not doing the right thing, because what that's going to do, of course, is it's going to be a demotivator for people. So if that's considered to be the second thing that came out of Pink's research. Now, the third key element around stimulating intrinsic motivation in knowledge workers, and this is another area that's highly underestimated, is for managers to give context to the tasks that people do. So basically what that means is explaining the purpose of the work that people do. Now, this comes back to Simon Sinek's work on the why of work. And what we need to do is, when we're briefing people in the workplace and we're giving people projects, assignments and tasks to do, and many of them might seem mundane or very ordinary, we need to explain the relevance of it. Because often when people are given tasks to do in the workplace, they can't see the forest for the trees. They just see the task in front of them, and there's not much there that might be motivating for them. However, if the leader actually explains the relevance of it, either in terms of how it will impact or how it will detract from achieving an objective. In other words, if something's not done right, it can be detrimental to achieving an organisational objective. And if it is done right, it can achieve a lot for that organisational objective. So it is important to give context to that. Now, the problem with that is that managers often think that, or they assume that the person that they've delegated the task to actually understands the relevance of it. Big mistake. And secondly, it takes a little bit of time. So if I spend a bit of time explaining the context and the relevance of a task, I could be doing something else. Big mistake. So we need to explain that, and not to assume, of course, that people actually understand the relevance of that task. So I think it's very, very important to explain context. So in a nutshell, all of the stuff that you read and hear about stimulating human spirit in work boils down ultimately to three key concepts. Does the person have the freedom to make their own decisions? Does the person have the opportunity to grow and develop both professionally and personally? And does the person know why they're doing what they're doing and how it is aligned to the strategic direction of the organization? So I think if though it's a nice little framework, it's easy to remember, it's easy to forget too, I might say, but that ultimately is what will stimulate intrinsic motivation. And we do know that this is far more effective than using reward and punishment. Now, don't get me wrong there. I'm not suggesting for a minute that people shouldn't be pulled up when they produce substandard work. Of course they should. And don't get me wrong that people shouldn't be praised when they produce good work. Naturally, this is part of what a leader should do. But I'm pointing out to you that if you think that that's all that's required, you're missing a really important part of the jigsaw, and that is this whole concept of autonomy, mastery, and purpose, which are ultimately the three key elements. Now, one thing I want to give a plug to, next week I have the pleasure of working with Doug Brown and Wally Hawke, who are two international authorities on conversations to build trust and engagement. It's my work as well, and the three of us are going to put on a special presentation next week. We're doing one in the US, and I think most of you who are tuning in today would probably be best served by tuning into the Australasian audience, and that'll be 8:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time next Wednesday. And we're going to have a good conversation about conversations to build trust and engagement in the world of work. And what we're going to do is share with you three practical solutions for that. And it's free. We invite you along there. It's a 1-hour presentation, and certainly you can ask questions and so forth. But we all strongly believe that conversation is key to building trust and engagement in the world of work. And I'm not just talking about any old conversation. I'm talking about, very much performance and development conversations. So we'll share that with you next week. So we strongly urge you to join us. What you can do when you receive the slides is you can click on the link, or I'll also provide you with the slides. I'm away at the moment. You'll probably get the slides and the recording and the link sometime tomorrow. So keep your eyes tuned for that, but we'd love to have you involved in that. And if there are other people in your organization who you would like, who you think would benefit, please send them the link as well. And finally, last comment before I wrap up is if you'd like a copy of my book, The Future of Human Resources, Unlocking Human Potential, and of course, what I've shared with you today is part of that book. If you go onto Amazon, you can pre-order that for $45.21 right now, plus postage. But if you order through me, and there's my email address, I will be able to give you that book for $30 plus postage. I'll sign it for you and put you on the list, and you will be one of the first to receive that book. I'm very excited about the book. I've gone into it in great detail, and I've talked about what the future is in relation to human resources, and particularly with an emphasis on unlocking human potential, of which I've touched upon a little bit today. So you're more than welcome to send me an email, and I will certainly make sure that that happens. So thank you everyone for your time, and look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. I've also got another one on Friday. I didn't want to plug that today and confuse things, but we'd love to see you on Wednesday at 8:30. And of course, I'll run through some really interesting and practical tips on improving your levels of engagement and trust, and also how you might go about doing that. So thank you, everyone. All the best. Have a wonderful weekend, and we will catch up hopefully next Wednesday. Thanks, everyone. All the best, and goodbye.